Before we dive in, I'd like to ask a small favor. I'm pouring all my energy into reaching my goal of 1,000 subscribers, which means the world to me. Please, I'm asking you to hit that subscribe button. It's just a single click, but it gives me tremendous motivation to keep creating more videos. Thank you so much.
Eleanor Whitmore burned every letter Thomas Caldwell had ever written her, one by one, without a single tear, while her wedding gown still hung untouched behind her. Her best friend had stolen her future, and society was already sharpening its tongue. But Eleanor didn't collapse. She dressed, lifted her chin, and walked straight into the most important gathering Virginia had seen in years. If you've ever been underestimated by someone you trusted, stay with me until the very end. Subscribe to the channel and drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far this story has traveled. The morning Eleanor Whitmore was supposed to become a bride, she stood in her mother's kitchen and watched a beetle drag itself across the windowsill. It was an odd thing to fix her eyes on. The gown was upstairs. The flowers had been delivered before sunrise, white roses, cut fresh from the Bennett garden, of all places. The Reverend had confirmed his arrival. The Caldwell family carriage was expected before noon. Everything was in order. And yet, Eleanor watched that beetle like it was the only honest thing in the room. Her younger sister, Abigail, came through the door, her hair half-pinned and a ribbon caught in her teeth, chattering about seating arrangements and whether Cousin Margaret would cause a scene over the punch bowl. Their mother stood at the stove, stirring something she had already stirred too long. Her eyes were soft with that kind of proud sadness mothers carry when they know a daughter is about to leave the house for the last time. Eleanor smiled at the right moments. She answered when spoken to. She let Abigail fix the small pearl buttons at her wrist and laughed softly when her mother pressed a trembling hand to her cheek and said, "You look exactly like I did 30 years ago, before I understood what love costs." She hadn't thought much about those words at the time. She thought about them later, when everything came apart. The letter arrived at 11 o'clock. Not Thomas himself. A letter. The Whitmore housekeeper, Mrs. Pewitt, brought it up to Eleanor's room with the expression of a woman who already knew what was inside and had spent the walk up the stairs deciding how to arrange her face. She set it on the vanity table beside the hairbrush, said nothing, and left without closing the door all the way. Eleanor looked at the envelope for a long time before she opened it. Thomas Caldwell's handwriting was always careful. He wrote the way he spoke, measured, polite, each word placed like furniture in a room that no one ever actually used. She had once found that quality steadying, dependable. She had called it character. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it in thirds, set it back in the envelope, and sat very still for approximately 4 minutes. What Thomas Caldwell had written in his careful, measured hand was this: he could not go through with the marriage. He had struggled with this knowledge for longer than was fair to admit. He had deep respect for Eleanor, profound respect, he wrote, underlined, and he wished with everything in him that circumstances were different. But he had come to understand that his feelings had taken a different direction. He did not name the direction. He did not need to. He asked for her forgiveness. He asked for her discretion. He expressed his sincerest hope that she would find every happiness she deserved. He signed it. Yours in deepest regret, Thomas. Eleanor set the envelope down. She looked at her reflection in the vanity mirror. The woman looking back at her was dressed for a wedding, hair pinned, pearls at the throat. The small ivory comb her grandmother had left her tucked just above her right ear. She looked the part entirely. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked down at the front of the house, where 2 of the stable hands were talking by the gate, unaware that everything had changed. Then she went downstairs and told her mother. Margaret Whitmore did not take it quietly. She took it the way a woman takes the collapse of something she has spent 3 years quietly building. With noise, with tears, with a kind of furious grief that bounced off the walls of the front parlor and sent Abigail to the doorway and Mrs. Pewitt to the back of the house, where she wouldn't have to witness it. That boy, her mother said, and the word boy carried everything. That spineless, ungrateful boy. After everything we, after your father's. She stopped, started again. Who? Who is it? There's someone else. I know there's someone else. Mama, tell me who it is. It doesn't matter who. Eleanor Ann Whitmore. You tell me right now. Eleanor had known this moment would come from the second she read the letter. She had run through the calculation while she was still upstairs. How long she could delay it. Whether there was any version of this conversation that didn't end in her mother's heartbreak, twice in the same afternoon, there wasn't. "It's Clara," she said. The parlor went very quiet. Her mother sat down on the settee, slowly, the way people sit when their legs stop cooperating. She pressed both hands to her mouth and stared at the rug. Clara Bennett had been Eleanor's closest friend since they were girls of 9 and 11, sharing a hymn at the First Methodist Church. Clara had been present at every significant moment of Eleanor's adult life. She had helped Eleanor choose the fabric for her wedding gown. She had been slated to stand beside her as maid of honor. "Clara," her mother repeated, and the word came out like something she was tasting for poison. "Yes, how long?" "I don't know, Eleanor. I don't know, Mama." "I truly don't." Her mother looked at her then, really looked at her, the way she had looked at Eleanor since Eleanor was small, with that searching quality that always felt like her mother was checking her for structural damage. "What do you want to do?" It was the right question. It was exactly the right question, and Eleanor loved her mother fiercely for asking it instead of deciding for her. "I want to send word to the Reverend," Eleanor said, "and to the guests. I want it done quickly and quietly before anyone arrives, and I want the flowers taken out of the front room. And then," Eleanor thought about it, "and then, I'm going to the Jefferson County Summer Assembly tonight." Her mother stared at her. "Eleanor, I am not going to hide in this house. People will talk. People are going to talk regardless of what I do. The only question is what they'll be talking about." Eleanor straightened. "They can talk about a woman who fell apart, or they can talk about a woman who showed up." Her mother said nothing for a long time. Then she stood, smoothed her skirts, and walked to the door. "I'll have Mrs. Puett send the messages," she said. "Wear the dark green silk tonight, the one with the ivory trim. You look like yourself in that dress." The Jefferson County Summer Assembly was held every year in the upper rooms of the Fairfield Inn, which had been built wide enough to accommodate the kind of summer gathering that Virginia's planter class considered essential, not merely pleasant, but necessary. The way certain social rituals feel necessary to people who have organized their entire understanding of themselves around them. It was the gathering where marriages were quietly arranged over punch cups, where fortunes changed hands through handshakes that looked like pleasantries, where reputations were built, and more often, carefully dismantled. Eleanor arrived at 7. She came alone, which was itself a statement, though she hadn't intended it to be. Her mother had offered to accompany her. Abigail had offered twice. Eleanor had declined both, not out of stubbornness, but because she understood something about the room. She was about to walk into. A woman accompanied by anxious family reads as fragile. A woman who walks in alone reads as decided. She wore the dark green silk. She carried no fan. She had never much seen the point of fans. Mrs. Puett had repinned her hair before she left, and Eleanor had stood at the front door of the Whitmore house for exactly 30 seconds, her hand on the frame, breathing the summer night air and listening to the cicadas, and reminding herself of one thing she had learned from years of managing her late father's accounts. Numbers do not care about your feelings. They reward clear thinking. She walked in. The room knew immediately. It wasn't a dramatic thing. No one gasped. No one pointed. It was subtler than that, and therefore crueler. It was the small adjustments people make when something unexpected enters their field of vision. The slight turn of a head, the lowered voice, the way a conversation's tempo changes when the person being discussed walks through the door. Eleanor crossed the threshold and felt the shift pass through the room like a current. She collected a cup of punch from the table near the door, nodded to the Harding sisters, who were too startled to say anything ungracious, and moved along the far wall with the deliberate calm of a woman who had absolutely nowhere she needed to be, and no one whose opinion she was obligated to consider. She heard fragments. She was meant to, thought she'd stay home, poor thing. Can you imagine? Clara Bennett, of all people, never thought Thomas had it in him. Well, one has to wonder what she did wrong, doesn't one? That last one came from Charlotte Mayer. Mayer, who was 26 and had been quietly furious at Eleanor since the winter of 1814, for reasons Eleanor had never fully understood and had largely stopped trying to. Eleanor did not look in Charlotte's direction. She sipped her punch. She looked at the musicians in the corner, who were playing rather badly and with great confidence. Thomas and Clara arrived at 7:45. Eleanor knew the moment they walked in because the room changed again, differently this time. A kind of held breath, guilty curiosity, the particular social electricity of a room that contains a story and all of its participants at once. She didn't turn around right away. She finished the sentence she was saying to old Mr. Fairweather about the wet summer and its effect on corn yields, because Mr. Fairweather was 81 years old and had been nothing but kind to her family since before she was born, and he deserved the end of the sentence. Then she turned. Thomas looked terrible. She hadn't expected that. She had expected him to look relieved, that clean-washed look men get when they've finally done the cowardly thing they'd been avoiding. Instead, he looked like a man who had already discovered that freedom doesn't feel the way you imagine it will. Clara looked worse. She had dressed beautifully, the way Clara always dressed. Rose silk, her dark hair coiled perfectly, her skin luminous in the lamplight. She was objectively lovely. She was always objectively lovely. But there was something tight around her eyes and mouth, a quality that Eleanor recognized because she had seen it before on people doing the thing they know they shouldn't be doing. That specific pinching tension of someone performing confidence they don't quite have. Their eyes met across the room. Clara looked away first. Thomas did not. He held Eleanor's gaze for a long, wretched moment, and she watched something move through his face that she suspected was the realization that she was not broken, that she was standing here in dark green silk, drinking punch and discussing corn yields, and she was not broken, and he hadn't fully anticipated that. Eleanor held his gaze for another second, then turned back to Mr. Fairweather and asked whether he thought the early frost they'd had in April would cause problems come harvest. The cruelty began about an hour in. It came first from Preston Whitfield, who was 28 and whose family had lost a good deal of money in a shipping venture, and who had decided somewhere in his 20s that the surest way to feel powerful in a room was to find someone whose position was already compromised and push. He found Eleanor near the window where she had been talking to Mrs. Alcott about a book they'd both read, and he came with two of his friends at his back, the way men like him always did for the audience, because cruelty performed without witnesses doesn't satisfy the same hunger. "Miss Whitmore," he said with a smile that didn't reach the part of his face above his nose. "Brave of you to come out tonight, given everything." Eleanor looked at him with the expression she reserved for ledger errors. Calm, specific, faintly disappointed. "Mr. Whitfield must take real courage," he continued. "Or maybe just a shortage of better options for how to spend an evening," one of his friends snickered. "I spent this morning reviewing the quarterly accounts on our eastern parcel," Eleanor said pleasantly. "I find accounting rather more demanding than courage. Did you come over to talk about farming? I find I've been discussing agriculture quite a bit this evening. There seems to be a great deal of interest in the subject." Whitfield blinked. "I was simply saying you were saying something unkind because you believe my circumstances this evening make me an easy mark," Eleanor said still pleasantly, still at the same conversational volume she would use to discuss the weather. "I wonder if you'd like it to continue, or if you'd prefer to go back to whatever you were doing before you came over here." Whitfield opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Eleanor waited. He left. His friends left with him, somewhat faster, with the particular speed of people who have just seen something they didn't anticipate and haven't yet figured out how to feel about it. Mrs. Alcott said under her breath, "Well done, my dear." It was during this exchange, or just after it, in the small reverberating silence that followed Whitfield's retreat, that Nathaniel Harrington noticed Eleanor Whitmore for the first time. He had been in the room for 20 minutes. He had arrived late, which was his habit, and had spent most of those 20 minutes talking to Judge Caldwell Thomas's uncle, not his father, about a federal land claim that was complicating a purchase Nathaniel had been negotiating for the better part of a year. The conversation was necessary. The assembly itself was not particularly, but Nathaniel had learned long ago that influence is maintained through presence, and presence requires showing up even when you'd rather not. "I was 34 years old." He had been the primary owner and operator of Harrington Farms since he was 26, when his father had died of a fever that took him in 4 days without warning and left Nathaniel holding 6,000 acres and a pile of debt that had taken him 3 years of brutal, relentless work to clear. He had cleared it. He had then doubled the acreage. He had invested in river transport, in which he'd had the good sense to hire competent people and the good fortune that competent people in that industry were at the time easier to find than they are now. He was known in Jefferson County as someone who did not waste words or time. He was not known as someone who paid much attention to the social machinery of assemblies like this one. But something made him look up from his conversation with Judge Caldwell at the exact moment Preston Whitfield turned away from Eleanor Whitmore with that specific retreat velocity that men use when they have been comprehensively dismissed. Nathaniel looked at the woman standing by the window. She was talking to Mrs. Alcott now, her head slightly tilted, her cup still in her hand. She did not look triumphant. She did not look shaken. She looked like a woman who had handled something unpleasant and had moved on with the same energy she would have used to correct an error in a column of figures, thoroughly and without lingering. He had seen a great many things in his years managing people and land and difficult situations. He had rarely seen that. He turned back to Judge Caldwell. "Tell me," he said, "what do you know about the Whitmore family?" The second assault came from a direction Eleanor hadn't anticipated. She had been doing well. She knew she'd been doing well in the way that, you're managing something difficult because your body is cooperating and your voice is steady, and the terrible bright alertness that takes over when you're in real danger hasn't fractured into anything uncontrollable. She had handled Whitfield. She had maintained 3 separate conversations at an entirely normal register. She had consumed 2 cups of punch, which was probably 1 cup more than was wise on a stomach that hadn't eaten much today. But she'd felt the alternative was standing in the corner holding an empty cup, which struck her as a worse look. The second assault came from Thomas. He appeared at her left elbow around 9 o'clock, alone. Clara was across the room talking to the Henderson girls, and Eleanor had just enough warning to rearrange her face before he spoke. "Eleanor, Thomas, I wanted to say—" He stopped, ran a hand across the back of his neck. He was wearing a good coat, dark blue wool, despite the summer heat, and he looked miserable in it. "I handled this badly. I know that. Yes. I should have spoken to you directly much sooner. I should never have let it go on as long as—" "Thomas," she kept her voice quiet, not cold. She didn't have the energy for cold right now, and she wasn't sure she wanted it. "What do you want me to say? That it's all right? It isn't. That I forgive you? I don't yet. That I understand why you made the choices you made? I understand that you're a man who found it easier to say nothing than to say something difficult. And I understand that that quality in you has cost me a very significant amount." He flinched. "What I want," she continued at the same quiet register, "is for you to go back to Clara and leave me to my evening. And I want you to understand that I am not standing in this room tonight because I'm foolish. I'm standing here because this is my county, my community, and my life, and I am not leaving it to accommodate your guilt." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "You deserved better than me," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I did." He left. Eleanor turned back to the room and found that her hands were trembling very slightly. Not from grief, she realized, but from something more complicated. The specific exhaustion of holding yourself together in a room full of people who would prefer to see you fall apart. She needed air. She moved toward the side door that opened onto the inn's upper corridor, where there was a window at the far end, and considerably less observation. She was standing in that window, looking down at the lamplit street below, breathing carefully, when she heard footsteps in the corridor behind her. She turned. Nathaniel Harrington stood several feet away, holding his own cup of punch with the air of a man who had not come out here for punch. Eleanor had seen Nathaniel Harrington at various county functions over the years. She knew who he was in the way that everyone in Jefferson County knew who he was. Not personally, but by the weight of his presence in conversations, in land transactions, in the general texture of the county's economic life. He was the man whose acreage people referenced when calculating other people's acreage. He was the man whose word at a county meeting tended to settle discussions that other words had failed to settle. She had never spoken to him directly. He was taller than she'd registered from across rooms, and he was looking at her with an attentiveness that she found, after an evening of performance and calculation, unexpectedly disarming. "Mr. Harrington," she said. Miss Whitmore." He didn't come closer. He stayed where he was, near the corridor wall, as if he understood that she had come out here for solitude and was deciding whether she wanted company. "I won't take up your time if you'd rather be left alone. I only wanted to say—" He stopped. Something in his face shifted. A small adjustment, like a man who has prepared a sentence and then decided it's the wrong one. "I saw what happened with Whitfield." "Ah, you handled it well." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "Thank you. I don't mean that as flattery," he said. "I've watched 3 separate people handle Preston Whitfield badly in the last 2 years. You did it correctly. You didn't raise your voice, and you didn't apologize for existing. I found that apologizing for existing tends to encourage people to keep requiring it of you," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, more like the thing that happens before a smile, when a face registers something worth smiling about. "That's a sensible observation," he said. "I have a few of those." He was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable quiet, something else. The quiet of a man who spends most of his time thinking before he speaks, and is doing so now. "I knew your father," he said briefly. "We overlapped on a county drainage committee in 1811. He was a practical man." He was. Eleanor agreed and felt the familiar tug of that loss, which had blunted but not left in the 4 years since. "I understand you've been managing the Whitmore account since he passed." She looked at him more carefully. "You've been asking about me." "I asked Judge Caldwell who you were about an hour ago," he said with a directness that she found startling after an entire evening of people performing oblique cruelties and sideways kindnesses. "He said, he also told me." Nathaniel paused, and something moved across his face that she couldn't quite read. "He told me about today. I'm sorry for what you've had to manage this evening. I'm not looking for sympathy." "I know that," he said. "I could see that from across the room. That's actually why I followed you out here." Eleanor waited. "I'm not in the habit of making proposals at county assemblies," he said. "I want to be clear about that, but I am in the habit of recognizing a practical opportunity when I see one, and I believe you are the same, based on what I've seen and what Caldwell's told me about how you've kept the Whitmore land solvent these past 4 years." The corridor was very quiet. Below the window, a horse shifted in its harness. "What kind of proposal?" Eleanor asked. "A business arrangement," he said, "with the possibility of becoming something else, if it proves sensible for both parties." He looked at her steadily. "I need someone at Harrington Farms with the intelligence and integrity to manage what I can't oversee directly, while I'm handling the river transport business. I've had 3 managers in 4 years, all of them either incompetent or dishonest. I've run the numbers, and the cost of continuing to search is outweighing the cost of finding a permanent solution." He set his punch cup on the windowsill. "I'm not asking you to make a decision tonight. I'm asking whether you'd be willing to have a conversation." Eleanor looked at this man, this very direct, very serious man who had followed her out of a summer assembly to propose a business arrangement while she was breathing through the wreckage of her planned life. "Mr. Harrington," she said. "Yes, I would like to finish my evening first." He almost smiled. "Of course. But yes," she said, "I'm willing to have a conversation." He picked up his punch cup, nodded to her in the way that felt less like a social pleasantry and more like something being agreed to, and walked back toward the assembly room. Eleanor turned back to the window. Below, the street was exactly as it had been, lamplit, quiet. A dog was crossing the road with the unhurried purpose of a creature that has somewhere to be and trusts it will get there. Eleanor breathed out. The day had started with a letter that ended her planned future. It appeared, in the strange arithmetic of things, to have opened a different door entirely. She stood at the window for another minute, alone in the quiet that she had come out here to find. Then she straightened, adjusted the ivory comb above her ear, and walked back into the room. She did not look at Thomas. She didn't meet Clara's gaze. Instead, she rejoined Mrs. Alcott, their conversation about the book picking up where it had left off. She stayed until the last lantern in the assembly room had been turned low. This was her county, after all, and she wasn't finished with it yet. 3 days after the summer assembly, Eleanor Whitmore received a second letter. This one she opened immediately. It was short. Nathaniel Harrington wrote the way he spoke. No wasted words, no ornamental phrases, no sentences that existed only to soften the ones on either side of them. He proposed she come to Harrington Farms on Thursday morning at 9, if that was convenient. He would show her the operations. They would talk. She could ask whatever questions she had. He would answer them honestly. And he expected the same from her. He signed it simply, N. Harrington. Eleanor read it twice, set it on her father's old desk, and looked out the window for a moment. Then she wrote back, that Thursday at 9 was convenient, and sent the reply before she could think about it too hard. Her mother found her at the desk an hour later, and asked, with the specific, careful casualness of a woman who has already heard something and wants it confirmed, whether it was true that Nathaniel Harrington had spoken to her at the assembly. He did, Eleanor said, about a business arrangement. Her mother sat down across from her. Eleanor, I'm going to Harrington Farms Thursday morning to hear what he has in mind. Harrington Farms, her mother said it the way people say the name of a place that has a mythology attached to it, which, in Jefferson County, Harrington Farms did. 6,000 acres of prime Virginia land, river access, the largest single tobacco and grain operation in the county, the kind of place that people drove past slowly and discussed in terms of what it must be worth, because putting it in those terms was the only way to make it feel manageable. You're going there alone. I'm going there to have a conversation, Eleanor said, not to elope. You know what people will say. People are already saying things. I'd rather give them something accurate to work with. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then, what kind of man is he, truly? Eleanor thought about the corridor at the Fairfield Inn. The directness of him, the way he had stayed on his side of the hallway, at a careful and deliberate distance, as if he understood that she had come out there to be left alone and wanted her to know that he understood it. Practical, she said finally, and honest. I think, in the way that some men are honest not because it's kind, but because they've decided it's efficient. Her mother considered this. That can be a good quality, she said, in the right circumstances. I think these might be the right circumstances, Eleanor said. Eleanor arrived at Harrington Farms at 5 minutes before 9 on Thursday morning, which she did deliberately. Arriving early tells a person something different about you than arriving on time, and she wanted Nathaniel Harrington to have accurate information about her from the start. He was already outside when she arrived, not waiting exactly, but occupied with something near the main barn, talking to a man in work clothes who had the look of someone responsible for a great deal. He finished the conversation before Eleanor had fully dismounted, handed her horse off to a young stable hand with a brief word, and walked toward her with the unhurried directness that she was already beginning to recognize as simply how he moved through the world. Miss Whitmore, he said, thank you for coming. Thank you for the invitation, she said, and then, because she had decided on the ride over that she was not going to waste either of their mornings on social performance, I have questions. I expected you would, he said. Come and walk with me. That was the first thing that surprised her. The scope of it. She had managed the Whitmore accounts for 4 years, which had given her a working knowledge of land operations. But the Whitmore estate was 400 acres and a modest staff. Harrington Farms was a different order of magnitude entirely. The primary tobacco fields, the grain operation, the smokehouse, the mill that serviced not just the farm but a good portion of the surrounding county, the network of workers and tenant farmers whose arrangements Eleanor would need to understand if she was going to be of any use to anyone. Nathaniel walked her through it all without condescension, which was the second thing that surprised her. She had braced for the particular variety of explanation that men sometimes offered women in professional contexts, the kind that started several steps behind where it needed to start, and repeated itself more than necessary, and carried underneath it the quiet assumption that the listener might not keep up. She'd developed over 4 years of managing accounts in rooms full of men who hadn't expected her to be there, a precise sensitivity to that register. Nathaniel didn't use it. He talked to her the way he would talk to anyone he expected to be competent. He gave her the relevant information. He noted the gaps. "This is the part that's been poorly managed," he said at one point, with the same flatness he might use to indicate a fence that needed repair, and then showed her the ledgers to support the claim. The ledgers were a problem. Eleanor saw it within the first 10 minutes of reviewing them, standing at the table in the farm office where Nathaniel had spread 3 years of accounts. The previous manager, a man named Howell, who was apparently no longer employed at Harrington Farms, for reasons that the ledgers themselves began to suggest, had been sloppy in some places and suspiciously precise in others. The sloppy places were where money had been lost to poor planning. The suspiciously precise places were more troubling. "Did you know about the discrepancy in the Eastern parcel accounts?" she asked. Nathaniel looked at the ledger she was pointing to. "I suspected it. I didn't have the specificity to act on it. This column here is reconciled incorrectly, deliberately. I think the error is too consistent to be accidental." "How much?" Eleanor ran the numbers in her head, which she could do faster than most people could do on paper. A skill developed out of necessity and sharpened by years of practice. Somewhere between $300 and $400 over 18 months, based on what I can see here. I'd need the original supply receipts to be certain. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Then I'll have them pulled." "Also," she said, "your tenant agreements on the south parcels are below market rate. Not by much, but consistently. Either whoever negotiated them wasn't paying attention to current rates, or they were doing something with the difference. Howell negotiated those." "Then I'd want to talk to the tenants directly." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not surprise exactly, more like the look a person has when they've been searching for a specific thing and have found it in an unexpected location. "You've been looking at these ledgers for 11 minutes, he said. "I'm good with numbers," she said. "My father taught me before I could properly read. He said numbers were more honest than words." She paused. He was mostly right. They had the real conversation at a table outside, where one of the household staff brought coffee that Eleanor drank without comment on the quality, which was a decision she'd made going in. She was not going to be the kind of guest who required managing. Nathaniel laid it out plainly. He needed someone with the intelligence and the authority to oversee Harrington Farms while he was managing the river transport operations, which took him away from the property with increasing frequency that the farm's complexity didn't accommodate. He had tried 3 managers. The first had been competent but dishonest. The second had been honest but incompetent. The third had been, by his account, simply not equal to the scale of what was required. "What I need," he said, "is someone who can read a ledger, make a decision, and hold a line, in that order." "And you think I can do that?" Eleanor said. "I think you demonstrated in 20 minutes this morning that you can do the first 2, he said. "The third one I observed at the assembly last week." Eleanor wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Mr. Harrington, I want to be direct with you about something. Please, I am willing to work. I am willing to work hard, and I am willing to work at the level this operation requires. I am not, however, willing to do so under an arrangement that leaves my position here undefined or easily undone." She looked at him steadily. "My situation is what it is. I am aware that Jefferson County is watching what I do next. If I come to Harrington Farms in an ambiguous capacity, as a sort of unofficial manager whose presence is difficult to explain, I will have traded one unstable position for another. I need clarity." Nathaniel said nothing for a moment. "What kind of clarity?" he asked. "I would want a written agreement, formal, witnessed, with specific responsibilities and specific authority to act on those responsibilities without requiring your approval for every decision." She paused. "And I want to be paid fairly, not generously fairly, at the rate you would pay a competent male manager. That's what I intended to offer." "Good. Then we understand each other on that point. What other points are there?" Eleanor set her cup down. "I want to know why your marriage ended." The question landed in the space between them with considerable weight. Nathaniel's expression didn't change dramatically, but something in it recalibrated, like a compass needle settling. "That's a personal question," he said. "It is," she agreed. "You're proposing that I come to live and work on your property in a capacity that will invite a great deal of speculation about our arrangement. I would rather have accurate information about who I'm making that arrangement with than speculate alongside everyone else. He was quiet for a long moment. Her name was Judith, he said. We were married in 1815. She left in 1817. She didn't leave for another man. She left because she found this place isolating, and she found me difficult. He said the last word with the particular flatness of a person who has turned a painful thing over enough times that they've worn the emotion down to its factual core. She was not wrong. I'm not easy to live with. I work too much. I think about the farm when I should be thinking about other things. I have been told by more than one person that I treat human relationships with the same pragmatism I apply to land management. And do you? Eleanor asked. Probably, he said, though I'm trying to determine whether that's actually a flaw or simply an honest way of operating. It depends entirely on whether the other person in the relationship knows that's what they're dealing with, Eleanor said. Something shifted in his expression. That same thing, he said, the thing that happened just before a smile that wasn't quite one. Yes, he said, I think that's right. Eleanor picked up her coffee again. I don't need someone who is easy, she said. I need someone who is honest. Easy has already proven unreliable. She agreed to come to Harrington Farms at the end of that Thursday morning, sitting at the table with 2 cups of coffee between them, and the Jefferson County summer pressing down on the Virginia fields in all directions. The agreement was simple and documented within the week. Eleanor would serve as farm manager with full operational authority over day-to-day decisions. She would review all accounts, renegotiate the tenant agreements on the south parcels, and investigate the Howell discrepancies with the intent to pursue restitution where possible. Nathaniel would be consulted on decisions above a certain financial threshold. Below that threshold, Eleanor's judgment was final. She moved to Harrington Farms on a Monday with 2 trunks. Her father's account ledgers offered a point of reference, and her mother's expression betrayed a resolve born of facing something that terrified her. Write to me, her mother urged. Every week, Eleanor promised. Then, halting, her mother pressed her lips together, trying again. You know your own worth. Don't let anyone in that house, on that property, or in this county convince you otherwise. Eleanor embraced her mother, holding on a beat longer than usual, then stepped into the carriage. The first week at Harrington Farms was a trial by fire. Eleanor knew it, and the staff knew it. They weren't unkind, but they were cautious. A subtler, often more challenging approach to navigate. Caution implies observation. They were waiting to see if this newcomer would improve or complicate their lives. Their judgment was reserved with the practiced professionalism of those who had been burned by previous arrangements. Eleanor had encountered such scrutiny before, in rooms filled with watchful eyes, where people weighed her value. She understood that the only response to such scrutiny was consistent, unshowy competence. She began with the ledgers. For 3 days, she did nothing but pore over accounts, reconcile receipts, and build a comprehensive picture of the farm's financial health. From sunrise until the light failed, she worked at the farm office table, breaking only for meals. By the end of the 3rd day, she had a clear accounting of the Howell discrepancies, $412 over 20 months, siphoned through inflated supply costs and manipulated tenant payment records. She also identified 17 operational decisions made poorly, some through carelessness, others through deliberate intent. On the 4th day, she presented her findings to Nathaniel. He was in the main house, occupied with correspondence, when she knocked. He bid her enter, looked up from his papers, and absorbed her summary for a long, silent stretch. $412, he stated, and 17 cents, she added. I want to pursue restitution. I believe it's recoverable. How? Howell owns land of his own. Not much, but some. If he's willing to negotiate quietly, we avoid the legal costs of a formal complaint and recover most of the amount. If not, we file the complaint and let the courts handle it. She paused. I'd recommend offering him the quiet option first, not because he deserves consideration, but because it's faster and less expensive. Nathaniel regarded her across the desk. Do it, he said. There's also the matter of the tenant agreements, she continued. I'd like to meet with the South Parcel tenants this week. I'll have their names sent to you. I've already found them in the records, she replied. I'll send word myself. He set the summary down. For a moment, he simply studied her with that familiar, appraising gaze she was learning was his natural way of observing. He sought accurate understanding. You've been here 4 days, he remarked. I'm aware. Most people spend 4 days locating things. I found out where everything was the first morning. The rest of the time, I've been using them. He nodded once, returning to his correspondence. Eleanor left the office and got to work. The whispers began before the second week concluded. She had anticipated them, factoring them into her calculations from the outset. Just as one accounts for weather when planting, Jefferson County was bound to talk. The only question was the form the gossip would take. Eleanor, armed with sufficient social intelligence, knew that form would not be kind. Some of it reached her directly. Bess, a kitchen maid of about 16, had the misfortune to repeat, within Eleanor's hearing, something she'd overheard in town. The gist was that Eleanor Whitmore had manufactured an opportunity from a scandal, that she'd been angling for a position at Harrington Farms since the moment Thomas Caldwell broke their engagement, and that her entire presence at the assembly had been calculated. Bess went pale as Eleanor's expression registered. I'm sorry, Miss Whitmore, I shouldn't have. No, Eleanor said. It's all right, Bess. I'd rather know what people are saying than not know. She folded the piece of linen she'd been holding and placed it on the stack. What else are they saying? Bess hesitated. I won't be angry with you, Eleanor assured her. I promise. I think, Bess ventured carefully, that you fixed 3 things in this house last week that have been broken since before I started here, and you did it without making anyone feel stupid about it. She paused. I think that's harder than most people realize. Eleanor looked at her. That's a perceptive thing to say. Bess shrugged with the understated eloquence of a 16-year-old whose intelligence outstripped her current circumstances. Clara Bennett arrived at Harrington Farms on a Wednesday afternoon, a development Eleanor had least expected, and therefore, perhaps, one she should have anticipated. Clara always possessed that knack for doing precisely the thing you hadn't prepared for, at precisely the moment your reserves were depleted. She arrived in a Bendit family carriage, dressed in yellow muslin, radiating a fragile beauty, the kind that suggests someone has held something difficult together through sheer force of will and is beginning to feel the strain. Eleanor was in the yard, discussing the drying schedule for the East Barnes tobacco with Marcus, one of the senior farmhands. It was an unfinished conversation she had no desire to interrupt when she heard the carriage wheels, turned, and saw Clara stepping down. For a moment, they stood frozen. Then Eleanor said to Marcus, We'll finish this in an hour, and walked toward Clara. They faced each other in the yard of Harrington Farms, beneath the Virginia summer sky, with 6 months of shared history and the wreckage of a friendship and a broken engagement lying between them, like discarded furniture. Clara, Eleanor began. Eleanor. Clara's voice was carefully modulated. Eleanor could hear the preparation, the rehearsed quality, the sense of someone who had constructed a framework for this conversation and was hoping it would hold. I wanted to come and speak to you properly. All right, I owe you an explanation. You owe me considerably more than that, Eleanor said. But yes, an explanation would be a start. Clara flinched. Good, Eleanor added, her voice quiet, devoid of heat. This was somehow worse than if she had shouted. I didn't plan it, Clara said. I want you to know that. It was never, I wasn't calculating anything. I never wanted to hurt you. And yet, Eleanor replied, I know. Clara pressed her lips together, her eyes bright, fighting a battle within. I know that what I want doesn't change what happened. I understand that. I needed you to hear from me that it wasn't malicious, that I didn't spend years pretending to be your friend while secretly. Clara, Eleanor interrupted. I believe you. That it wasn't calculated. Calculation would have been easier to understand. She looked at her former friend steadily. What I can't understand, what I've spent weeks trying to grasp, is how a person who knew me as well as you did could have watched what was happening and said nothing for however long it was occurring. You could have told me. You could have come to me as a friend and said, Something has developed between Thomas and me and I don't know what to do with it. I would have been hurt. I would have been furious. But I would have respected you for telling me. She paused. Instead, I read it in a letter, on my wedding morning. Clara said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Eleanor was right, and they both knew it. Sometimes, the most painful truth in a conversation is the one that arrives without any escape routes. Are you happy? Eleanor asked after a moment. Clara looked up, surprised by the question. What? With Thomas? Are you happy? The pause before Clara answered was longer than it should have been, and more honest than anything she said next. It's still very new, Clara said. We're navigating a great deal. That's not an answer. We're managing, Clara replied with the flat tone of someone who has just realized they are managing the very thing they chose. Eleanor nodded. I hope it becomes more than that, she said. For your sake, because I don't want to be the kind of woman who wishes her former friend an unhappy life. But I also can't be your friend right now, Clara. I'm not saying I never can be. I'm saying I'm not there yet, and I need you to respect that. Clara nodded once. She looked younger than Eleanor had ever seen her. I understand. All right, then. Clara got back into the Bennett carriage. Eleanor watched it roll out of the yard, then stood in the heat for a moment, breathing. Then she returned to Marcus and the drying schedule, because the tobacco needed tending to, and the world did not pause for unfulfilled reunions. Nathaniel found her that evening at the farm office table, still working by lamplight an hour after everyone else had finished for the day. He stopped in the doorway. I heard Clara Bennett came by. She did, Eleanor said, without looking up from the ledger. And we talked. She made a note in the margin, and it's managed. He was silent for a moment. She could feel him in the doorway, unmoving. You didn't tell me she was coming, he said. I didn't know she was coming. Are you all right? Eleanor looked up at that. It wasn't the question she had expected from him, and the tone was different from his usual register, less practical, more measured, as if he had decided this particular inquiry required a different approach. I'm working, she said. I can see that. Then yes, she added, I'm all right. He didn't leave. He moved into the office, poured water from the pitcher into the spare cup on the shelf, and set it on the table near her elbow. Then he sat down across from her, not in a way that demanded anything, but settling as a person settles when they intend to be somewhere for a while without requiring company. Eleanor looked at the cup, then at him. What are you doing? She asked. Sitting, he said. You've been working since 6 this morning. I thought you might want company that doesn't require anything from you. She looked at him for a long moment. That's an unexpectedly thoughtful thing to do, she said. I have them occasionally, he replied, and pulled a book from the desk behind him, opening it. Eleanor looked back down at her ledger. For the next hour, in the lamplight of the Harrington Farms office, they worked and read in the same room, in a silence that, against all reasonable expectation, was entirely comfortable. It was the first hour all week that Eleanor hadn't felt like she was holding something together by sheer force. She didn't comment on it, but she noticed, and she suspected, though she said nothing, that he had intended for her to. The week the Howell matter came to a head was also the week Eleanor understood that Harrington Farms had, without her consciously deciding it, become something she cared about. It wasn't a sentimental realization. It arrived not with warmth or softness, but the way most honest realizations do, sideways, while she was occupied with something else entirely. In this instance, she was reviewing the amended tenant agreements for the South parcels, agreements she had spent the better part of 2 weeks renegotiating with 8 different families, each with their own concerns and differing thresholds of trust, and all of whom, by the end of the process, had shaken her hand with the particular grip of people who had decided to believe someone. She placed the last signed agreement atop the stack, and a feeling settled in her chest, one she hadn't experienced in a long time. Not exactly happiness, but something steadier, the quiet satisfaction of things falling into their rightful place. She was still savoring that sensation when Marcus tapped on her office door. A courier had arrived from the county seat, he announced, and he carried news about Howell. Daniel Howell hadn't opted for the silent route. Eleanor had sent him the offer 3 weeks prior, a formal, witnessed, and documented letter detailing the discrepancies. She had identified the exact sum in question and the terms under which Harrington Farms would settle the matter privately, averting a court case. He'd been given 30 days to respond. She had penned the letter with the precise clarity of someone who wanted no ambiguity about the proposal nor about the consequences of refusal. Howell had not responded within the allotted time. Instead, Eleanor now learned from the courier he had approached Thomas Caldwell's father, Richard Caldwell. Richard was one of Jefferson County's most prosperous merchants, and it turned out harbored a long-standing, intricate financial entanglement with Nathaniel Harrington, including shared stakes in several river transport contracts. What Richard Caldwell had done with that information was far worse. He had visited 3 other influential county families, spreading the word that the woman Nathaniel Harrington had placed on his farm had leveled false accusations against a loyal former employee. He claimed the discrepancy Eleanor had uncovered was a mere accounting error, not malice. Furthermore, he asserted that Eleanor Whitmore, who had arrived at Harrington Farms under already dubious circumstances, was now overstepping her authority in ways that would tarnish the Harrington name and destabilize the very business relationships the county relied upon. Eleanor absorbed this news with the same stillness it took to thank the courier, close the office door, and walk to the window. Then, she turned back, resumed her seat at the desk, and retrieved a fresh sheet of paper. She penned a 3-sentence missive to Nathaniel, who was in Richmond on business. She informed him of the situation, stated her intended course of action, and declared her immediate intention to file with the county court. She requested he send the original supply contracts from Howell's tenure via return courier, a request she hadn't made earlier, as she'd hoped to resolve the matter without legal intervention. She sealed the letter and dispatched it before noon. His reply arrived the following morning, equally concise. "Proceed," it read. "The contracts will reach you by Thursday. N.H." Below that, in handwriting that wavered slightly, as if an afterthought, "Don't let them rattle you." Eleanor read those 4 words 3 times. Then, she folded the letter, placed it in her desk drawer, and returned to her work. Richard Caldwell himself arrived at Harrington Farms on a Thursday afternoon, a visit Eleanor had partly anticipated. He brought 2 companions, Franklin Marsh, who held lumber interests along the river, and a county magistrate named Ogden. Ogden was apparently a personal acquaintance of Caldwell's, and his presence was clearly a deliberate form of pressure. Eleanor received them in the front parlor, standing. She had made a conscious decision not to sit. Sitting invited a certain dynamic of conversation where the other party dictated the terms, a dynamic she had no intention of permitting. Richard Caldwell, 61, well-fed and accustomed to commanding any space he occupied, possessed the bearing of a man who had been the most significant voice in most conversations for the past 3 decades. So much so that he no longer perceived it as a choice, but an inherent truth. He regarded Eleanor with the particular impatience of someone who had identified an obstruction and was calculating the quickest method of removal, not with overt anger. "Miss Whitmore," he began, "I appreciate you seeing us." "Of course," Eleanor replied. "Though I must note, Mr. Caldwell, that you didn't send word of your visit, so I'm afraid I can only offer you a few minutes. I have a meeting with the farm's harvest coordinator this afternoon that I cannot postpone." The harvest coordinator meeting was indeed real, scheduled for 4 o'clock. It was currently 2:30, leaving her 90 minutes. But Richard Caldwell didn't know the precise time, and the implication that he had arrived inconveniently and would be granted only a brief audience was accurate. Caldwell's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He had intended to set the pace of this encounter. He recalibrated. "We won't take long," he conceded. "I wanted to speak with you directly, regarding the matter of Daniel Howell. I have reason to believe there may be some misunderstanding concerning the nature of the discrepancies you've identified." "There is no misunderstanding," Eleanor stated. "The discrepancies are documented, substantiated by original receipts, and cross-referenced with tenant payment records for the relevant period. The total amounts to $412.17. I filed the formal complaint with the county court this morning." Silence descended. Marsh glanced at Caldwell. Ogden stared at the floor. "You filed this morning?" Caldwell asked. Yes, without consulting Mr. Harrington. Mr. Harrington and I are in correspondence, Eleanor replied. He is aware of my actions and has authorized them in writing. She paused. Is there something specific about the documentation you wish to discuss? I'm happy to walk you through the methodology. Caldwell's jaw tightened. Miss Whitmore, I'll be blunt. Daniel Howell has worked in this county for 20 years. He has a family. He has standing. What you're proposing would damage him considerably. What Mr. Howell did damaged Mr. Harrington considerably, Eleanor countered, her tone mirroring his exactly. Over 20 months, methodically. I imagine it required some effort. She let the statement hang in the air. I've also observed that no one has suggested the documentation is inaccurate. The argument I'm hearing is that the consequences of accurate documentation are inconvenient. That's a different concern. Ogden looked up from the floor. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps mid-40s, and he wore the expression of a man who had arrived expecting to be useful and was now questioning whether he'd been given the full picture beforehand. Miss Whitmore, Ogden said, his voice more measured than Caldwell's. Perhaps there's a way to resolve this that doesn't require— The way to resolve it was the private settlement I offered Mr. Howell 6 weeks ago, Eleanor interjected. He declined that option. The matter is now with the court, which is where it belongs. She met his gaze steadily. I appreciate you coming, Magistrate Ogden. I want to be respectful of your time, but I want to be equally clear that my decision is made and documented. The only thing that would alter it is evidence that the documentation is incorrect. No one in this room has suggested that. Another silence, longer and heavier than the first. Caldwell looked at her, his expression having shifted from impatience to something colder. You understand, he said quietly, that there are business relationships connected to this farm that extend far beyond any single accounting dispute. There are individuals in this county whose goodwill Mr. Harrington depends upon. Eleanor met his gaze. And there are individuals in this county, she replied, her voice equally quiet, who depend on the honest management of the land they work and the honest accounting of the money they pay. I work for them too. She paused. If Mr. Harrington's business relationships depend on tolerating financial misconduct on his own property, then he deserves to know that. And if those relationships cannot withstand an honest accounting, they were never a solid foundation to begin with. Richard Caldwell studied her for a long moment, the look in his eyes akin to how Thomas must have regarded her on the night of the assembly. A man confronting the realization that the individual he had assessed as manageable was anything but. He left without another word. Marsh followed him. Ogden paused at the door, turned back, and to Eleanor's considerable surprise asked, The documentation? Where can I review it? I'll have a copy sent to your office by tomorrow morning, she replied. Thank you, Ogden said, his tone even suggesting he had arrived at the same conclusion she had, and was prepared to follow where it led. That evening she wrote to Nathaniel, providing a full account of the visit. His reply arrived the next morning, swift as a man who had been anticipating it. He had written more than usual, 3 full paragraphs, which for Nathaniel Harrington was verging on an oration. He stated that the visit confirmed his suspicions about the depth and entanglement of the relationship between Caldwell and Howell, and that he possessed his own information regarding a river transport contract that warranted investigation. He assured her she had handled the situation correctly. He indicated that upon his return from Richmond the following week, he wished to sit down with her and review everything together. Then, at the bottom of the 3rd paragraph, in the same slightly less controlled script as his previous letter, he added, You said something to Caldwell about people depending on honest management of the land they work. I want you to know I heard that. I know you weren't just talking about them. Eleanor held that sentence for a moment before placing the letter in the drawer with the other and returning to her work. Nathaniel returned from Richmond on a Friday evening, a fact Eleanor knew from the sound of the carriage arriving in the yard while she was still in the office. 10 minutes later, he walked through the office door without announcement, carrying 2 cups of coffee, with the air of a man who had endured an 8-hour journey and had made one specific decision about how he wished to spend his first 10 minutes at home. Eleanor looked up. Welcome back, she said. Tell me about Caldwell, he replied, settling into the chair opposite her and pushing 1 cup across the table. So she recounted everything. The visit, the 3 men, Ogden's question at the door, the documentation she'd sent, the status of the court filing. She was thorough and chronological, observing Nathaniel's face as she spoke, noting the subtle cues that indicated what was resonating and what was being filed away for later consideration. When she finished, he was silent for a moment. Ogden asked to review the documentation, he said. Yes. On his way out. Yes. After Caldwell had already left. That's correct. Nathaniel sipped his coffee. Ogden has been on the wrong side of a Caldwell business, dealing himself. 2 years ago, timber rights dispute. He didn't win it. He set the cup down. He's not going to be Caldwell's instrument in this. I suspected as much, Eleanor remarked. He had the look of a man who'd been handed a narrative and was beginning to notice its inconsistencies. Nathaniel looked at her. How long? About 40 seconds after he walked in, she replied. He wouldn't meet Caldwell's eyes when I pushed back on the documentation. People who believe what they've been told meet your eyes when you challenge it. People who don't keep looking at the floor. Something flickered across Nathaniel's expression, warmer and more specific than what she was accustomed to seeing. It arrived and passed quickly, as things do when a person hasn't quite decided how much space to allocate them. I want to talk about the transport contracts, he said. Tomorrow, tonight, she replied. You look like a man who's been sitting in a carriage since morning and hasn't eaten properly. Eat first. He looked at her. That was an instruction, a clear directive she'd received for the first time since her acquaintance with Nathaniel Harrington. A genuine brief laugh startled out of him, as if he hadn't anticipated letting it escape. Yes, ma'am, he replied, the unfamiliar address settling into the room between them with a certain unspoken weight. The twist Eleanor hadn't foreseen didn't come from Caldwell, Howell, Thomas, Clara, or the usual county gossip. It emerged from within Harrington Farms itself, from a direction so close she'd almost missed it. The second farm manager, the one Nathaniel had described as honest but incompetent, was a man named George Putnam. He'd left the farm 8 months prior and had since apparently landed a position with a competing landowner 2 counties over. Eleanor had known this in the abstract, like background details that hadn't yet seemed relevant. What she hadn't known was that Putnam had made copies of certain Harrington Farms contracts and operational documents before he left. Not all of them, and not the most sensitive, but enough. And what he had done with those copies, Eleanor discovered on a Tuesday morning when old Marcus approached her with a look she'd never seen before. It told her, before he even spoke, that whatever he was about to say was serious. Miss Whitmore, Marcus began, I need to tell you something I probably should have told you sooner. I didn't because I wasn't sure it mattered, then I wasn't sure it was my place. Last night, I decided those were both poor reasons for staying quiet. Tell me, Eleanor said. Marcus revealed that Putnam had been in contact with Richard Caldwell, not recently, but before? The Howell situation had surfaced. Putnam had shared what he knew about the farm's operations, its contracts, its financial arrangements with the river transport investors. Marcus believed Putnam had done it not for money, or not primarily for it, but because he'd left Harrington Farms feeling dismissed unfairly. He'd wanted, in that way aggrieved people sometimes do, to be the source of someone's problem. Eleanor absorbed this for a moment. Does Mr. Harrington know? She asked. I don't believe so, Marcus said. I'm not certain, but I don't think so. Why are you telling me and not him? Marcus looked at her with the directness of a man who had thoroughly considered his answer. Because I've watched you for 6 weeks, he said, and I've watched him for 6 years, and you're the one who's going to know what to do with this information without it becoming something bigger than it needs to be. Eleanor considered this. That's a significant amount of trust to extend to someone you've known 6 weeks. I reckon it is, Marcus conceded, but I've been wrong about people before, and I've been right about people before, and I know which one this is. Eleanor stood. I'm going to need everything you know. When the contact happened, how, what specifically was discussed? Can you do that? Yes, ma'am. All right. She straightened her apron. And Marcus, thank you for deciding it was your place. He nodded with the particular gravity of a man who has done the right thing after wrestling with it and is relieved to find it was received correctly. That evening, Eleanor told Nathaniel. She didn't soften it, laying out the facts. Putnam, the documents, the Caldwell connection, the timeline Marcus had reconstructed, and what it implied about how much of the Howell situation had been genuinely spontaneous and how much had been orchestrated. Nathaniel remained unnervingly still as she spoke. When she finished, the quiet in the room was different from their usual quiet. This one had weight. "Putnam," he said. "Yes, I dismissed him because he made 3 consecutive bad calls on the East Parcel planting schedule, costing the farm a significant portion of that season's yield." He paused. "I thought he accepted it." "He didn't," Eleanor said. "No." Nathaniel set his hands flat on the desk. "I can see now that he didn't." Something moved across his face, not quite anger, but its colder, harder cousin. "How far does this go?" "The Caldwell connection." "Is he using Putnam's information actively, or was this preliminary?" "I believe preliminary," Eleanor said. "I think Caldwell wanted intelligence before he moved. The Howell situation gave him an excuse to move sooner than he planned, and he misjudged how far along I was with the documentation." She paused. "He thought I was still building the case." "I had already built it." Nathaniel looked at her. "Because you worked faster than he expected." "Because I work faster than most people expect," she said, without apology. Another silence. Then, quietly, "What would you do if this were your decision entirely?" Eleanor was slightly surprised by the question, not because it was inappropriate, but because of its completely open nature. He asked it with no suggestion of what answer he was hoping for, a question that demanded a genuine response. "I would go to Caldwell directly," she said. "Not through lawyers, not through intermediaries. I would sit across from him and put everything on the table. The Howell documentation, the Putnam connection, the transport contract irregularities that you mentioned last week. All of it. And I would give him one opportunity to resolve this cleanly, privately, and permanently. Not because he deserves the opportunity, but because a public fight with Richard Caldwell costs time and social capital that this farm needs for other things." She paused. "And because I want him to know that I know everything, not just the piece he expected me to find." Nathaniel was looking at her with that specific, focused quality she'd come to recognize. The one that meant he was filing something away, not just as information, but as something he intended to return to. "That's exactly what I would do," he said. "I know," she said. "How do you know?" "Because it's the most efficient path to a durable resolution," she said. "And efficiency is how you think." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm beginning to think," he said slowly, "that I understand you rather better than I should, given how long we've known each other." Eleanor held his gaze. "That makes 2 of us." The room was very quiet. Then, because neither of them was the kind of person to let important things sit undefined when naming them clearly would cost less in the long run, Nathaniel Harrington said carefully and directly, the way he said everything, "Eleanor, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly." "When have I done anything else?" she replied. "Fair point." He looked at the desk for a moment, then back at her. "What are we doing here? The 2 of us, in this arrangement." Eleanor didn't look away. "I think," she said, "that we're doing something that neither of us planned for, and both of us are handling very carefully because we've both been wrong about people before, and we're not interested in being wrong again." "Is that all?" "No," she said, "but I think that's as far as I'm prepared to name it tonight." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, with the specific quality of a man accepting the terms of a negotiation he intends to return to. "All right," he said. "Tonight, then, we plan the meeting with Caldwell." "Yes," she said, and they did. They worked for 2 more hours by lamplight, building the case piece by piece, and the entire time there was something different in the room, something that had been named just enough to change the quality of the silence between them, without yet having been named so fully that it required them to change anything else. Eleanor drove home to the Whitmore house near midnight, as she still maintained the formal arrangement of sleeping in her own family home rather than at Harrington Farms. She sat in the carriage in the dark, listened to the horses, and allowed herself, for just a few minutes, to feel everything she had been keeping in precise and professional order for the past 6 weeks. She thought about the ledgers and the tenant agreements, and Marcus, and the Caldwell meeting they were going to have, and the Howell case moving through county court, and the $412.17 that would be recovered. She thought about how Harrington Farms was running better than it had in 3 years, and that she had done that. And she thought about a man who had followed her into a corridor at an assembly because he had recognized something in her that most people in that room had been actively trying not to see. She didn't let herself think too far past that, but she let herself think that far. When the carriage pulled up to the Whitmore house and she went inside, her mother looked up from her chair by the lamp and said quietly, "You look different." Eleanor paused at the foot of the stairs and considered how to answer. "I feel like myself," she said finally. Her mother looked at her for a long moment, with that searching quality, checking for damage. She found none. "Good," her mother said. "That's how it should be." Eleanor climbed the stairs. She was asleep before the lamp at the bottom of the stairs was out. The meeting with Richard Caldwell happened on a Monday morning at the Caldwell counting house in the county seat. It was Caldwell's territory, his choice of ground, and Eleanor had agreed to it without argument, because she understood something Caldwell apparently did not. The location of a meeting only matters if you need the room to do your fighting for you. She didn't. Nathaniel had offered to come. He'd offered twice, actually. Once the evening they planned it, and once the morning of, when he'd found Eleanor already dressed and reviewing her notes at the farm office table before sunrise. He'd stood in the doorway with his coffee and said quietly, "I can be there." "I know you can," Eleanor said without looking up. "I'd rather go alone. Caldwell will take that as a weakness. Caldwell will take it as a woman walking into his counting house without a man to speak for her. Then I'll start talking, and he'll understand his mistake, and by that point, it will already be too late for him to adjust." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. She could feel him doing the calculation, weighing his own instinct to be present against his understanding that she was right. "Take the full documentation," he said finally. "Every receipt, every cross-reference." "I already have it, and if he threatens the transport contracts, then I'll tell him what I told you 2 nights ago." Eleanor said, "A business relationship requiring us to tolerate misconduct on our own property isn't a relationship worth preserving." She meant it just as much as she did then. Another pause. Then, "All right." She looked up. He was watching her with that focused, careful quality. The one she'd come to understand was not detachment as she'd initially read it, but a kind of precise attention he gave to things he considered important. "Don't let him make you feel like you're the one who created this problem. Mr. Harrington," she said, "I have been managing men who wanted me to feel like the problem since I was 20 years old. I'm quite good at not obliging them." He almost smiled. "Yes," he said, "I know." She left for the county seat at 8 o'clock. Richard Caldwell was already in his counting house when she arrived, which told her he was nervous. Men who are confident in their position arrive slightly late. It signals they have other demands on their time, and this one is being graciously accommodated. Men who arrive early are men who have been preparing. He had one other person in the room, a younger man seated near the window, introduced as his associate, Garrett, who had the look of someone brought to take notes and witness. Eleanor sized him up in about 4 seconds and decided he wouldn't be a problem. She sat down opposite Caldwell, placed her document case on the table, and didn't open it immediately. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Caldwell said, with the formal pleasantry of a man who wants to set a civil tone because he believes it will give him an advantage. "Of course," Eleanor replied. "I'll be direct, Mr. Caldwell, since I know you have other business today, and so do I." She opened the document case. "I have the complete accounting of the Howell discrepancy, original receipts, cross-reference tenant records, and a summary that has already been filed with the county court. I also have documentation of the communications between Mr. Howell and your office during the period in question, which were obtained as part of the court filing process." She set 3 folders on the table, aligned precisely. "I also have a separate file relating to the river transport contracts, specifically the arrangement that was renegotiated in the spring of 1818, under circumstances that I believe the other contract parties would find interesting if they were fully explained." Caldwell's face didn't change, but his hand, resting on the edge of the table, pressed down slightly. Eleanor noticed. "That's a broad set of materials," he said. "It is," she agreed. "I wanted us to have a complete conversation." "What is it you're proposing?" "I'm proposing that the Howell matter proceed through the court as filed," Eleanor said. "I'm not offering another private settlement. That opportunity was offered and declined. What I am offering is this. If you withdraw your interference in the court proceedings, and if the transport contract irregularities are corrected in the next renegotiation cycle, I will not pursue the transport matter separately. The court handles Howell. The contracts are corrected going forward. We conclude this without escalation." Caldwell looked at the folders, then at Eleanor. "And if I decline that offer? Then I file the transport matter separately," Eleanor said, at the same conversational register she might use to discuss planting schedules. "And I make certain that the other investors in those contracts are aware that a formal inquiry is underway, which they currently are not. I understand several of them are also your business partners in other ventures. I imagine they'd appreciate advance notice rather than learning about it through court documents." Silence. Garrett, near the window, had stopped writing. Caldwell looked at Eleanor with an expression she recognized. She had seen it on Preston Whitfield's face at the summer assembly, and on Thomas Caldwell's face in the parlor of the Whitmore house, and on her father's debtors in the years before he died, when she had sat in on the collections conversations that no one expected her to remember. It was the expression of a man recalculating the distance between where he thought he was and where he actually was. "You're very confident," Caldwell said, and it was not quite a compliment. "I'm very accurate," Eleanor said, "which is different, but I understand why people confuse them." Another silence. Caldwell straightened in his chair and said, with the specific flatness of a man accepting terms he had not expected to accept, "The court proceeding continues. The contracts will be reviewed in the next cycle." "Thank you," Eleanor said. She gathered her folders, returned them to the document case, and stood. "I appreciate your time, Mr. Caldwell." He looked up at her. Something in his expression had shifted past the cold calculation into something that was almost, in spite of everything, a species of respect. "Nathaniel Harrington knows what he has in you," he said. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said, "he does." She left the counting house at 5 minutes past 9, walked to where her carriage waited, and sat down and breathed for exactly 30 seconds. Then she drove back to Harrington Farms. Nathaniel was waiting in the yard. He hadn't gone inside, which meant he'd been waiting long enough that going inside had stopped seeming worth it. He was talking to Marcus when her carriage came through, but he stopped the moment he saw it. She stepped down and crossed to him, and she could see him reading her face in the way he'd learned to read it over these weeks. That efficient, thorough scan that didn't miss much. "It's done," she said. He exhaled just slightly, just enough that she caught it. "The transport matter, agreed to correct in the next cycle. The Howell proceeding continues undisturbed." He was quiet for a moment. Marcus wisely found something else to attend to across the yard. "How did he take it?" Nathaniel asked. "Better than I expected by the end," she said. "He said something at the end." She paused, because she had been deciding since the carriage ride home whether to repeat it, and she had decided yes. He said, "You know what you have in me." Nathaniel looked at her. Something moved through his expression. "He's right," Nathaniel said quietly. Directly, without the careful qualification he usually applied to statements of that kind. Eleanor held his gaze for a moment. "I know," she said. She walked past him into the house because there was paperwork waiting, and she needed about 10 minutes alone with it before she was going to be useful to anyone. But she was smiling as she went through the door. October came in fast that year, the way Virginia October sometimes did. The heat conceding all at once, overnight, the mornings arriving with a bite that the afternoons hadn't yet earned. Eleanor had been at Harrington Farms for 3 months by the time the harvest was in, and the 3 months had remade her in ways she was only beginning to properly account for. The work had been the first thing. The specific satisfaction of a thing done correctly at scale, the accounts clean, the tenant relationship stable, the Howell restitution proceeding through the court, with Magistrate Ogden presiding, The farm's operational capacity measurably improved in ways that could be demonstrated in numbers. Eleanor liked numbers. She trusted them. They didn't tell you what you wanted to hear. They told you what was there. The second thing was the people. Marcus, who had decided she was worth trusting and had been consistently correct about that decision. Bess, who had evolved from cautious kitchen maid to something closer to an ally, sharp and observant, and increasingly willing to say what she saw. The tenant families on the south parcels, who had begun to bring their concerns to Eleanor directly, and with the ease of people who had learned that the concern would be heard. The third thing was harder to account for in numbers, and so Eleanor spent considerably less time accounting for it and considerably more time existing inside it, which was unusual for her, and which she was managing by deciding it was simply a new kind of operational reality she was adapting to. The third thing was Nathaniel. He had told her he was difficult. He had said it himself in the corridor at the Fairfield Inn, with the frank self-awareness of a man who had learned his own dimensions through the specific pain of having them outlined for him. He worked too much. He thought about the farm when he should be thinking about other things. He was not easy. All of that was true. She had discovered it to be true in the day-to-day texture of working alongside him, the way he could be fully present, and then suddenly entirely elsewhere, occupied by some calculation that had nothing to do with the room he was standing in. The way he delivered criticism with a precision that was accurate and efficient, and occasionally, to the unprepared, startling. The way he asked questions that went straight to the center of a thing, with no detour through the polite exterior. She found all of this comprehensively manageable. More than that, she found it, if she was honest with herself in the quiet of her own mind, something she had been looking for without knowing what to call it. Nathaniel didn't perform himself. He didn't arrange himself to be comfortable. He was simply what he was, fully and without apology. And he extended to her the same expectation, that she be what she was, fully and without apology. No one had ever offered her that before. Not even Thomas, who had claimed to love her, and had loved, she understood now, the version of her that didn't inconveniently require anything. The proposal, when it came, arrived in no form she had anticipated. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. Eleanor was at the main house going over the harvest accounts, the final tallies, which had come in better than projected by a margin significant enough to warrant a letter to the river transport investors. Nathaniel was across the table from her with his own papers, in the pattern they had fallen into so naturally that Eleanor had stopped noticing it as a deliberate thing and had begun to understand it as simply the shape of her evenings. She looked up at some point. She couldn't have said why, some shift in the quality of the silence, and found him watching her. Not the way he looked at things he was calculating. The other way, the way she'd caught only in glimpses before, because he was careful, because he had told her himself that he'd been wrong about this once, and carried the cost of it. And careful was how he operated now. "What I said," he began. "I want to marry you." He said it the way he said everything, directly, without preamble, as if he had decided that the space between thinking a thing and saying it was simply overhead. He wasn't prepared to carry any longer. Eleanor set her pen down. "That's not a question," she said. "No," he agreed. "I know what I want. I'm less certain what you want, which is the relevant information." He set his own pen down. "So I'll ask it as a question. Will you marry me?" Eleanor looked at him across the table. This very serious, very direct, unexpectedly decent man who had followed her into a corridor 4 months ago because he had seen something in her that a room full of people had been actively trying not to see, and who had given her the room and the authority and the trust to be the full version of herself, and who sat across from her in the evenings without requiring her to be anything other than what she was. "You should know," she said, "that I will not become a less complicated person after marriage." "I'm not looking for less complicated," he said. "I'm looking for honestly complicated. There's a significant difference. I will still have opinions about the accounts." "I expect so. Your opinions about the accounts have saved this farm a considerable sum of money. I will not defer to you on matters where I believe I'm right. I wouldn't respect you if you did." Eleanor looked at him for another long moment. "You've thought about this for approximately 6 weeks." "Weeks," he said. I wanted to be certain I was asking for the right reasons. And are you? Yes, he said, with the specific flatness of a man who has done the analysis and is confident in the conclusion. I am asking because I want to spend the rest of my life at the same table as someone who sees things as clearly as you do, and because I think you are the only person I've encountered in my adult life who makes this house feel like something more than on a very large and well-run property. Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest. Not grief, not anxiety. The other thing, the one she'd been keeping in careful order. Yes, she said. He blinked just slightly. Yes, yes, she said again, with the edge of something that was almost amusement. I thought you were a man who appreciated directness. I am, he said. And then he stopped, and something crossed his face that she had not seen before. Not the careful, controlled surface, not the precise professional register, but something underneath. Something real and unguarded and slightly undone. Yes, he said finally, more quietly. All right, yes. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. It was a simple gesture, no fanfare, no embellishment, just his hand covering hers, warm and steady. Eleanor looked down at it, then up at him, and the room fell utterly silent. Everything that had been fractured in the spring and painstakingly mended in the months since settled into its new, resilient form. They were married in November. The ceremony, by county standards, was intimate, but for Eleanor, it was precisely as it should be. Her mother sat in the front row, dabbing at quiet tears, doing her best to remain composed. Abigail, beside her, squeezed Eleanor's hand, a silent, steadfast presence. In the back, Marcus stood with his hat clutched in both hands, his expression a particular, satisfied one, the kind that belongs to those who recognize truth long before anyone else. Jefferson County, as was its habit, buzzed with gossip. Some of it was kind. Some of it carried the bitter tang of those who had anticipated Eleanor Whitmore's quiet failure and were now compelled to witness her defiant success. Charlotte Mayer was rumored to have called the marriage convenient, a statement that held the sharp accuracy of all half-truths. It captured a sliver of reality while entirely missing the heart of it. Thomas Caldwell dispatched a formal note of congratulation, his careful script adorning the page. Eleanor read it once, then consigned it to the fire, not from malice, but because its contents held no value for her. Clara sent nothing. Eleanor considered this for a brief moment, then concluded that Clara's silence was perhaps the most genuine thing she had offered in a long time. The winter's unexpected turn wasn't a dramatic event. It arrived subtly, as so many profoundly significant things do, not with a sudden upheaval, but as a slow, unfolding revelation of something that had always been true, patiently awaiting its moment. In December, 2 months after the wedding, Magistrate Ogden paid Eleanor a visit. He had presided over the Howell restitution case and arrived at Harrington Farms with the unmistakable air of a man bearing news that would irrevocably alter the landscape of the situation. He sat opposite Eleanor in the farm office, politely declined coffee, and placed a manila folder on the table. "Mrs. Harrington," he began, and Eleanor felt the unfamiliar weight of that address, a novelty she hadn't quite anticipated. In the course of the Howell proceedings, we've uncovered something that extends beyond the original complaint. Eleanor's gaze fixed on the folder. How far beyond? Significantly, Ogden replied. Howell wasn't operating independently. We believed he was receiving direction, or at least encouragement, from a party with a vested financial interest in destabilizing Harrington Farms' operational accounts. He opened the folder. We now have documentation that Richard Caldwell was not merely receiving information from Howell, he was directing him, specifically instructing him to manipulate the tenant payment records in a way that would provide Caldwell grounds to claim a share of the South Parcel revenues under an older land agreement he believed was still in effect. Eleanor froze. The 1812 agreement. Ogden's gaze sharpened. You know of it. It appeared in the original Harrington land records when I first reviewed the accounts, she said carefully. It seemed to have been superseded by a subsequent agreement in 1814. I noted it in my initial review but didn't pursue it, believing it to be inactive. Caldwell believed it was not, Ogden stated. and he was using Howell to engineer the financial conditions that would allow him to make that argument in court. He was preparing to file a claim against approximately 400 acres of the South parcels, using falsified payment records as evidence that the 1812 agreement's terms had never been properly honored. The room fell into a profound stillness. Eleanor looked from the folder to Ogden. "He came to my meeting," she said slowly, piecing it together as she spoke. "He agreed to the terms I offered. He withdrew his interference in the court proceedings. Because by that point," Ogden interjected, "he knew the court proceedings were going to uncover precisely this. He agreed to your terms because he wanted to limit what you would bring forward. He thought settling the Howell matter quietly would shut down the investigation before it reached him. But it didn't. The documentation was already in the court record. Once filed, the process could move forward regardless of what either party agreed to privately." He looked at her, a flicker of genuine professional respect in his eyes. "The fact that you filed before meeting with him, Mrs. Harrington, that was the deciding factor." Eleanor sat with this revelation for a long moment. She recalled the morning she'd written to Nathaniel from the farm office, informing him of her intention to file before noon. She remembered his terse, four-word reply: "Don't let them rattle you." She thought of that Monday morning when she'd walked into Caldwell's counting house alone, 3 folders precisely aligned on the table, and offered him terms she knew, even then, were more lenient than the full picture warranted. She had gone to that meeting believing she was managing the Howell situation. Unbeknownst to her, she had been managing something far grander. "What happens now?" she asked. "The land claim Caldwell was preparing cannot be filed," Ogden said. "The evidence he intended to use has been revealed as fabricated. He is currently the subject of his own inquiry, which I expect to result in formal proceedings within the month." He closed his folder. "The South parcels are secure. The 1814 agreement supersedes the 1812 arrangement without question." Eleanor gazed out the window for a moment, her mind's eye fixed on those 400 acres. The land where 8 tenant families had just signed renegotiated agreements. The land where she had spent 2 weeks forging relationships. People now protected from a claim they hadn't even known existed. All because of work that had begun as a straightforward accounting review. "I need to tell my husband," she said. "I expected you would want to," Ogden replied. He stood, gathered his folder, and paused. "Mrs. Harrington, the work you did on those accounts, identifying the Howell discrepancy, filing when you did, pursuing it to the degree you did. Do you understand that without that work, this entire situation unfolds very differently? The claim gets filed, the fabricated records become the primary evidence, and it becomes a protracted legal dispute over land that Caldwell might well have won, given his resources and his relationships in this county." Eleanor met his gaze. "I was doing my job," she said. "Yes," Ogden affirmed. "You were. Very well." He placed his hat on and offered a polite nod. "Good day, Mrs. Harrington." She found Nathaniel in the east barn, poring over winter storage arrangements with one of the farmhands. She waited patiently until they concluded their discussion, then told him everything. She watched his face shift through a rapid succession of emotions, dawning comprehension, shrewd calculation, and then a quieter, more profound tenderness that settled over him once the others had passed. He looked at her. "The South parcels," he said, his voice laced with a new weight. "All secure," she confirmed. Ogden confirmed it. "If you hadn't filed when you did," he began, then stopped, rephrased. "This farm, what you've done here, I want you to understand that I know what this is, what it truly is. You don't have to." "I do," he said, his voice firm, "because I haven't always been good at saying the things that need to be said, and I've decided I'm not going to continue that pattern." He looked at her directly, his gaze holding the same focused intensity he reserved for matters of utmost importance. "You came here with 2 trunks and your father's ledgers, and you built something. You built something I couldn't have built without you, and I want you to know that I know that. Not in a general sense, but specifically. 400 acres of that land are still ours today because of decisions you made, some of which you didn't even grasp the full stakes of when you made them." Eleanor held his gaze, her own quiet and steady. "I know," she said softly. Good, he replied. Then, with the directness that was his characteristic expression of love, he added, "And don't forget it." She didn't forget. She didn't forget any of it. Not that day, nor the days that followed, nor the months that slowly transformed Harrington Farms into the kind of place people in Jefferson County began to discuss, with a sense of bewildered awe. A farm that ran better than it had in a generation. A manager, a woman for heaven's sake, who could look at a column of figures and see what others had tried to conceal. A marriage between two complex, capable individuals who had found each other at the precise moment they had both ceased to expect it. She remembered the morning of her would-be wedding, the letter in Thomas Caldwell's precise hand, the moment she'd stood by the window in her wedding attire and resolved not to disappear. She held on to it all, not as a collection of wounds, but as a record. Evidence of the chasm between who she had been and who she was becoming, documented with the same meticulous accuracy she applied to everything, complete, precise, and without sentimentality. The woman Jefferson County had expected to crumble had not crumbled. Instead, she had quietly become someone they would have to reckon with, and she was only just beginning. The Caldwell proceedings commenced the second week of January. It was a morning so frigid that the breath of everyone entering the county courthouse emerged in visible clouds. Jefferson County turned out for it with the same thoroughness and anticipation they reserved for events that blended legal consequence with social spectacle. Eleanor did not attend the first day. She had considered it, weighing it with her usual practicality, balancing her personal desire against the situation's demands. What she wanted was to sit in that courtroom and witness Richard Caldwell face the repercussions of his actions. What the situation called for was a woman who didn't need to observe that to feel its weight. She remained at Harrington Farms, reviewing the winter grain reports, and awaited Marcus's account of the day's events when he returned from town at dusk. Marcus knocked on the office door at 5 o'clock, his energy charged with the relief of finally being able to set down the significant news he had carried all day. Caldwell's attorney tried to argue the fabricated records were Howell's doing exclusively, Marcus reported. That Caldwell had no knowledge of the specifics. How far did that get them? Eleanor inquired. About as far as you'd expect, Marcus replied. Ogden had the correspondence, the letters between Caldwell and Howell that emerged during the court filing process. 3 of them specifically discussed the tenant record manipulation. Caldwell's name is on all 3. Eleanor set down her pen. The 1812 land agreement claim withdrawn entirely? His attorney withdrew it before noon, Marcus confirmed, before they even reached the evidence portion. He paused. Word is Caldwell's own investors started pulling back this morning, once the proceedings started. 2 of his river transport partners had their attorneys in the gallery. Eleanor absorbed this, her expression unreadable. How did he look? She asked. Marcus considered the question with the honest assessment of a man who valued accuracy, like a man who spent years believing he was the kind of person things happened to other people, he said, and found out this morning he was wrong. Eleanor nodded once, then picked up her pen again. Thank you, Marcus. She walked to the door, then stopped. Mrs. Harrington, there's one more thing. He turned back. Thomas Caldwell was in the gallery. Not Richard, Thomas. He sat in the back row the whole morning and left before the noon recess. Eleanor was silent for a moment. Alone? She asked. Alone? Marcus confirmed. She said nothing else. Marcus left. She sat with the lamp and the grain reports and the specific, complicated weight of that particular piece of information. Thomas, sitting alone in the back row of a courtroom, watching his father's name become part of the county record in a way it would not recover from, and she let herself feel the full texture of it before she put it away. She did not feel triumphant. She had expected, in the months leading to this, that she might. That when the thing finally arrived, when the people who had dismissed her and underestimated her and arranged themselves around her failure faced their own accounting, she would feel something large and clean and satisfying. What she felt instead was quieter, more like the way you feel when a wound you'd stopped noticing finally finishes closing. Not the absence of pain exactly, but the absence of the place where the pain was. Joe Nathaniel came home from the county seat at 7 o'clock, having attended the afternoon session. He came through the door with the specific quality of a man who has watched something significant and is still processing the full weight of it. He found Eleanor in the main house front room, not working for once, sitting near the window with a cup of tea. She'd let it go cold. He sat down across from her without preamble. "It's going to go badly for him," Nathaniel said. "Caldwell, not just the land claim. The transport partners are pulling contracts. 3 of them have already filed notices of intent. His position in this county is not going to be what it was by the end of this." "I know," Eleanor said. "You don't seem surprised." "I'm not," she said. "A structure built on other people's compromised positions can only hold as long as people are willing to stay compromised. Once one part of it goes, the rest recalculates." She looked at him. "How was Thomas?" Nathaniel paused. "You heard he was there. Marcus told me." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. He looked like a man watching his father become a stranger. He said with the spare precision that was how he described hard things. I don't know what he believed about his father before today, but he believed something different by the time he left. Eleanor held her cold cup of tea. "That's not something I wanted for him," she said. "I know that," Nathaniel said. And he did know it. She could hear the understanding in it, the specific recognition of a man who had been paying close enough attention to know the difference between what Eleanor wanted and what she simply allowed to happen. "This isn't what I came to Harrington Farms for," she said. "Meaning all of it, the Caldwell proceedings, the court filing, the 400 acres, the county watching. I came to manage accounts." "You came because a room full of people expected you to disappear," Nathaniel said, "and you refused. Everything after that was a consequence of that one decision." He looked at her steadily. "You don't need to apologize for the consequences." Eleanor looked at him across the front room of the house that was now hers as much as his, in the January evening, with the cold pressing against the windows and the lamp doing its work between them. "I know," she said. "I just want to be the kind of person who notices the cost of things, even when the outcome is right." Nathaniel held her gaze for a long moment. "That," he said quietly, "is exactly why I trust your judgment." The second twist arrived not from the courthouse, but from a direction Eleanor had long since stopped watching. Clara Bennett came to Harrington Farms for the second time in the 3rd week of January, and this time she did not arrive in the Bennett family carriage. She arrived in a hired conveyance, and she arrived alone, and she arrived with the look of a woman who has been holding something difficult together for a very long time and has finally accepted that she cannot hold it alone any further. Eleanor received her in the front room. She did not make her wait, which would have been unkind, and she did not offer elaborate warmth, which would have been dishonest. She offered a chair and tea, and her attention, which was what she had available. Clara sat down. She looked at Eleanor and for a moment said nothing at all, which was unusual for Clara, who had always filled silence easily and often automatically. "Thomas has left," Clara said. Eleanor went still. "Left where?" "Jefferson County." Clara pressed her hands together in her lap. "He left last week. He's gone to his mother's family in Philadelphia." She stopped. "He's not coming back. Not to me," she said. "He said a great many things, but the short of it is that he realized, watching the proceedings, that he had made a series of choices that he couldn't explain to himself anymore." Her voice stayed even, which Eleanor recognized as a significant act of will. "He said he thought he'd been chasing something, and he wasn't certain anymore what it had been." The room was very quiet. "Clara," Eleanor said carefully, "are you all right?" "No," Clara said, with a directness that was so unlike her usual management of appearances that Eleanor felt the honest answer land with real force. "No, I'm not. I made choices that cost you something I can't give back. And then those choices cost me the thing I traded yours for, and I'm sitting here because—" She stopped, looked at her hands. "Because you are the only person I know who tells the truth, even when it's difficult, and I am very tired of being in rooms where nobody tells the truth." Eleanor looked at her, this woman who had been her closest friend, who had betrayed her, who had worn the cost of that betrayal in the tight lines around her eyes for the better part of a year. "What do you want?" Eleanor asked, not unkindly, directly. "I don't know," Clara admitted. I think I wanted to sit across from you and say that I'm sorry properly. Not the way I said it in your yard last summer, which was an apology for my discomfort, rather than an apology for your pain. She looked up. I'm sorry, Eleanor, for what I did, and for how long it took me to say it correctly. Eleanor sat with that for a long moment. I accept that, Eleanor said finally. I want you to know that I mean it. I'm not saying it to close the conversation. I accept it. Clara exhaled. Something in her posture released slightly. Thank you. I also want to be honest with you about where we are, Eleanor continued. We are not the same as we were. I don't believe we'll be what we were again. I think you understand that. Yes, Clara said. I do. But I'm not your enemy. I haven't been your enemy, Eleanor said. I've been a person managing the consequences of what you did, and those consequences are largely managed now. She paused. If you need help, practical help, people in this county who can be trusted, I'll give you names that I can do. Clara looked at her with the specific expression of someone receiving more than they arrived expecting. That's more than I deserve, Clara said. Probably, Eleanor agreed, but I find I'm less interested in what people deserve and more interested in what's actually useful. She picked up her tea. Write to me when you're settled. Let me know how you are. Clara left 20 minutes later, and Eleanor stood at the window and watched the hired carriage go down the drive and thought about the arithmetic of forgiveness. Not the easy kind. Not the kind that requires nothing but the other kind. The kind that costs something and is given anyway. Not because the other person has earned it, but because carrying it is heavier than letting it go. She found that she did not feel diminished by it. She felt, if anything, more solidly herself. The Jefferson County Spring Assembly arrived in April, the way spring always arrived in Virginia, with an insistence that felt almost argumentative after the long, gray patience of winter, everything suddenly pressing toward the light at once. Eleanor had not planned to attend. It was Nathaniel who suggested it, which surprised her, because Nathaniel was not a man given to social engineering. He raised it over breakfast, in a way that was carefully casual, which was how she'd learned to recognize when he'd been thinking about something for several days and had finally decided to say it. The spring assembly is Friday, he said. I know, Eleanor said, not looking up from the correspondence she was reading. I think we should go. She looked up. Then he was looking at his coffee, with the particular focus of a man who is not actually looking at his coffee. Why? She asked. Because Jefferson County has been watching you for 9 months, he said. And what they've watched is a woman who did her work and let it speak for itself. I think it's time to let them see the whole picture. Eleanor considered this. You want to make an appearance? I want to have dinner with my wife at the county assembly, he said. Whether other people draw conclusions from that is their concern. She held his gaze for a moment. You're being strategic. I'm always strategic, he said. That doesn't make it less true. She looked back at her correspondence. The dark green silk is still in good condition, she said. He almost smiled into his coffee. I know. They arrived at the Fairfield Inn on Friday evening at 7 o'clock, which was not early and was not fashionably late, which was exactly the point. They arrived the way people arrive when they have somewhere to be, and no particular opinion about who else is there. The room did what rooms do. Eleanor felt the shift, the current, the collective recalibration of a crowd, processing new information and old history simultaneously. She had felt it 9 months ago, when she walked into the same room in the same dress, alone, with the wreckage of her planned future still fresh enough that she could feel it in her chest. She felt it differently now. She felt it from the other side. She was aware, with the specific clarity that comes from having survived something, of exactly how much the room had changed, and how much of that change she had made herself, the tenant families who had signed new agreements. The 400 acres still part of Harrington Farms, the Howell restitution paid in full through the court process, with 17 cents. The Caldwell proceedings now concluded, with results that had reshaped the county's financial landscape considerably. None of it had happened in this room. But all of it was visible in this room, in the way people moved when she walked past, the specific quality of the attention she received. Not the predatory curiosity of last summer, Not the waiting for collapse energy that she had walked through and held herself against. Something else. Something that felt tentatively and accurately like recognition. Charlotte Mayer found her near the punch table within the first 20 minutes, which Eleanor had half expected because Charlotte had a gift for locating the exact spot in a social gathering where she could do the most recalibrating. "Mrs. Harrington," Charlotte said, and the name sat in her mouth with a quality Eleanor couldn't quite read. Some combination of adjustment and something that almost resembled concession. "Charlotte," Eleanor said pleasantly, "you look well." Charlotte said it the way she said most things, with the faint implication that she had considered saying something else and had chosen this instead. "Thank you," Eleanor said, "so do you." A pause. Charlotte was a woman who generally had the next thing ready, and Eleanor watched her locate it, which took slightly longer than usual. "I heard about the Caldwell proceedings," Charlotte said. "The outcome?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "That was your work, the documentation." "My work and the court's process," Eleanor said. Charlotte looked at her with an expression Eleanor recognized as one she had worn herself. Once. The expression of a person who has organized their understanding of someone around an assumption and has just been required to update the assumption and is doing so in real time, with the particular discomfort of a calculation that isn't going the expected direction. "I said something unkind about your marriage," Charlotte said finally and flatly. "Last autumn I called it convenient. I heard Eleanor said it wasn't accurate," Charlotte said, the words coming out with the specific effort of a proud person producing something that cost them. "No," Eleanor agreed. "It wasn't." Charlotte nodded once. "Well," she said. "Good evening, Mrs. Harrington." "Good evening, Charlotte." Charlotte moved away, and Eleanor turned back to the room. She did not smile, not because she wasn't pleased, but because there was something more interesting happening across the room that had just claimed her full attention. Thomas Caldwell was at the assembly. He had come back from Philadelphia, apparently, or had never left as permanently as Clara had implied. Eleanor would find out later that the stay in Philadelphia had lasted 3 weeks, and that Thomas had returned not because his circumstances had improved, but because he had decided that running from them accomplished nothing, which was possibly the most self-aware thing he had managed in the last year. He looked different. Not dramatically. He was still Thomas, still the careful coat and the measured bearing, but something in the arrangement of him had changed. The particular ease that wealthy young men carry, the unself-conscious assumption that the room is organized around their comfort, was gone. In its place was something more complicated, and Eleanor thought, more honest. He crossed to her with the deliberate quality of a man who has made a decision and is executing it before he can reconsider. "Eleanor," he said. "Thomas," she said. "I wanted to. I've been wanting to speak with you since the proceedings." He stopped, started again with the visible effort of someone who has prepared this and is now finding that preparation doesn't help as much as they hoped. "My father's situation. What your work uncovered. I want you to know that I didn't know the scope of it. What he was planning against the farm, against you and Nathaniel, I didn't know." "I believe you," Eleanor said. It was the truth. Thomas had many qualities that had failed her, but deliberate dishonesty of that kind had never been one of them. He looked slightly undone by her directness. "I owe you more than an apology," he said. "For this past year, all of it. What I did to you in the spring, how I did it, and then my father's involvement in everything that followed." "Thomas," she said, it gently but firmly, "what you did in the spring hurt me. I won't pretend otherwise, but it also put me exactly where I needed to be, and I've made something here that I wouldn't trade. You don't need to spend the rest of your life apologizing to me. You need to figure out what you actually want, and go live it honestly. That's what I needed to do. It turned out to be possible." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're remarkable," he said quietly. "I want you to know I understand that now, fully." "I know," she said simply. "Good evening, Thomas." He nodded with the specific gravity of someone receiving both a dismissal and a kindness and understanding that they are the same thing, and walked back into the room. Nathaniel found her 20 minutes later, which meant he had been watching from a careful distance and had given her the space to manage it herself, which was so entirely characteristic of him that she felt the warmth of it settle in her chest. "Thomas Caldwell," he said. Not a question. He apologized, she said. How'd he do? Better than I expected, she glanced at him. You watched from across the room. He confirmed without apology. I was available if you needed me. I didn't. I know. That's not why I was watching. She understood what he meant. He had been watching the way you watch something you value, not to guard it, but because you can't help it. She took his arm, which was not something she did casually or often, and felt him register the weight of it. Dance with me, she said. He looked at her with the slight surprise of a man who has just received an unexpected instruction. I'm not a skilled dancer. Neither am I, she said. We'll be accurately matched. He made the sound that was his version of a laugh, brief, genuine, caught off guard, and covered her hand on his arm with his, and they moved toward the floor where the musicians were playing something slow enough to manage. And Jefferson County watched Eleanor Whitmore Harrington dance with her husband in the room where 9 months prior they had expected her to fall apart. She did not fall apart, she never had. The final twist came not from a courtroom or a social gathering or any of the arenas where the past year's battles had been fought. It came in May, on an ordinary Tuesday morning in the farm office that had become the center of Eleanor's working world. She was reviewing the spring planting projections when Bess knocked on the door and told her that a man had arrived from Richmond, a federal land officer as it turned out, carrying documents relating to a survey dispute on the northern boundary of Harrington Farms that had been filed without anyone's knowledge at the farm by a party whose name Eleanor did not immediately recognize. She read the documents twice. Then she went to find Nathaniel, who was in the east barn, as he often was this time of morning, and he took the documents from her and read them with the specific stillness of a man absorbing something that requires complete attention. Not the land office filing itself, that was a shell, a formal instrument, but the originating party. The person who had initiated the survey dispute was Putnam, the same Putnam who had left Harrington Farms 8 months prior, carrying copies of operational documents. The same Putnam who had fed information to Richard Caldwell, who had apparently been more comprehensively coordinated with Caldwell's strategy than anyone had fully understood. Caldwell's land claim against the South parcels had failed. So Putnam, whether on his own initiative or carrying out some arrangement made before Caldwell's position collapsed, had filed a separate instrument against the northern boundary, a different legal mechanism, a different parcel, the same underlying objective. Nathaniel looked up from the documents. How long do we have? He asked. The survey is scheduled for July, Eleanor said. That gives us approximately 10 weeks. Can we contest it? We can, and we will, Eleanor said. But I want to understand the mechanism first. This isn't a straightforward boundary dispute. The filing references an easement claim that I've never seen in any of the property records. She paused. I need to go back through the original land grants, all of them, back to the 1790s, if necessary. Nathaniel looked at her. That's months of records. I know, Eleanor said. Nathaniel, she said it quietly, and with complete steadiness. I found $400.17 hidden in 18 months of manipulated ledgers. I found a land claim being built from fabricated payment records. I will find whatever is in those land grants. She met his eyes. This is what I do. He looked at her for a long moment. This man who had followed her into a corridor 9 months ago because he had seen something in her that a room full of people had been trying not to see, and who had spent every month since discovering that he had seen it accurately, and who had the specific expression now of a man who has stopped being surprised by the person he married, and has moved into something steadier and deeper than surprise. All right, he said, and then I'll have the original land grant boxes brought to the office this afternoon. Thank you, she said. She turned to go. Eleanor, she looked back. Whatever's in those records, he said. We find it together. She held his gaze. I know, she said. But I'm going to find it first. He smiled. A real one. Full and unguarded. The kind she still didn't see often enough, and valued precisely because of that. And she turned and walked back toward the house with the grant boxes already arranged in her mind, and the problem already beginning to take shape, and the specific, grounded, unshakable feeling of a woman who knows exactly who she is and exactly what she is capable of. That summer, Jefferson County began to tell a different story. Not immediately and not unanimously. Stories don't change all at once, especially in counties where people have a long memory and a considered attachment to their first impressions. But the new story moved the way true things move, gradually and then all at once, carried by the kind of evidence that doesn't require argument because it simply is. The Harrington South parcels had the best yield in 6 years. The tenant families who had signed Eleanor's renegotiated agreements were 3 months ahead of their previous payment schedules. The farm school that Eleanor had established for the children of the farm's workers, a one-room arrangement in the old grain storage building, staffed by a young woman from town who had more education than employment until Eleanor found her, had 14 students by midsummer and a waiting list. The northern boundary dispute was resolved in August, when Eleanor located, in the fourth box of original land grants, a 1793 document that rendered the easement claim Putnam had filed not merely contestable, but legally impossible. Ogden received her analysis on a Thursday. The survey scheduled for July was cancelled on a Friday. Putnam's filing was withdrawn. The matter was closed. Nathaniel had been in the office when she found it, sitting across the table reading his own work, being present the way he was present, thoroughly and without requirement. She had read the 1793 document twice, confirmed what it said, set it down, and looked up. Found it, she said. He looked up from his papers. Northern boundary, he said. Northern boundary, she confirmed. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I'll send for Ogden. Already written the letter, she said. He made the sound that was his version of a laugh, and went back to his papers, and Eleanor went back to hers, and the office was quiet, in the way it was always quiet between them, full rather than empty. On an evening in late September, a year and 2 months after Eleanor Whitmore had burned Thomas Caldwell's letters and put on the dark green silk dress and walked into a room full of people who expected her to be finished. She sat on the front steps of Harrington Farms in the last of the evening light, with Nathaniel beside her and Marcus's end-of-season report in her lap, and the farm settling into its autumn quiet all around them. He was looking at the fields with the particular expression of a man reviewing his life and finding it unexpectedly in order. Eleanor set the report down. I want to expand the school, she said. I know, he said. You've been thinking about it for a month. A permanent building, she said. And a second teacher. There are more children on the surrounding parcels who could attend if the capacity— Eleanor. She stopped. Yes to all of it, he said. As you know. She looked at him. Then why did you let me start explaining? Because I like listening to you think, he said, simply and entirely. She looked at him for a long moment, this complicated, direct, decent man, and felt the fullness of where she had arrived settle around her like something she had built herself, because she had every piece of it. She picked the report back up. The east parcel projection is too conservative, she said. I thought so too, he said, and they sat together in the last of the September light, talking about the farm and the school and the season and everything they were going to build next. The woman Jefferson County had gathered to watch collapse was still there, still standing, still building. She had not won because someone rescued her. She had not risen because someone chose her and made her worthy. She had won because she chose herself on the morning of a wedding that never happened, standing at a window in a dress she would never wear, deciding that she was not going to disappear to accommodate someone else's failure of courage. That decision had paved the way for every subsequent choice. The assembly, the office, the ledgers, the meticulous filing, the pivotal meeting with Caldwell, the marriage founded not on convenience, but on unwavering honesty, on genuine mutual understanding, rather than a mere polite charade. She hadn't ended up with what she'd initially envisioned. Instead, she had attained something richer, something more challenging, and something that was unequivocally her own. And there, on a farm in Jefferson County, Virginia, amidst the golden hues of autumn in 1820, Eleanor Whitmore Harrington sat beside the man who had perceived her true essence from the very outset, who had revealed to her the profound truth of her own inherent worth. As she surveyed all that she had painstakingly constructed, a profound certainty settled within her, absolute and unreserved. She was precisely where she was meant to be, not by chance, not by decree, but because she had forged her own path, brick by painstaking brick. That, she realized, was the only triumph that truly resonated, the only victory that ever truly mattered, and it belonged to her, and her alone.